Okay, I'm just going to say on there that today is August 27th, 1995. We're in Duluth, Minnesota. I'm going to be chatting with Joseph Gomer, originally of Iowa Falls, now of Duluth. What I usually do, Mr. Gomer, is I usually just start out by asking you to just sort of tell me where you were born and where you grew up. You want to just tell me about that?
Well, native Iowan, born in 1920, and it was a little unusual in that community of 5,000, there were only 2 black families, 3 later on, and so it was a little different environment, no ghettos or anything like that. We had no discrimination.
Were you born at home or in a hospital?
I was born at home and probably on the kitchen table. Those were the days.
And that was on River Street, you told me earlier.
And our doctors were Ray and Peggleton, and they had a very well-equipped office, really, and they could handle just about anything, but it was crude by today's standards.
And you had one sibling, or did he come along later?
Later.
Okay, you had a younger brother later on.
I have a younger brother, Charles.
So, did you go to school then in Iowa Falls too?
I went all the way through the school system in Iowa Falls.
And since Iowa Falls people might be listening to this someday, where were the schools located, if you remember?
Well, there was kindergarten in the old high school building.
Okay.
And there was an elementary building on the northwest corner in the same block as the old high school.
That's what they later called Central School, right?
I can't even remember the name of that old elementary building, which they tore down.
Okay. And then where did you actually go to high school at? Where was the building located?
The building was located on Roxylvania, and it was right across from the old Lutheran church.
Okay. So I think that was what was later called Central School, and it became a grade school. It's Fairway grocery store now. Okay, and what year did you graduate?
1938.
And how many people were in your class, do you remember?
I think there were approximately 85.
Okay.
You have to remember, this is ancient history.
I understand. So you graduated in 38. Now, what did you do after graduation? Did you go into the service right away?
No, I attended Ellsworth.
Okay. How long did you go to Ellsworth?
Well, I attended the 2 years there, and I was 1A, and I was 1A for a year and a half, so rather than going to any further college at that time, I went into the military.
And what year was that?
That was July of 1942. I took a bus to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Private Regular Army, 17058-104.
Let's back up. When you were at Ellsworth, is that where you learned to fly a plane?
Right.
Okay, tell me about that. Tell me about the program they had.
Well, they got into the civilian pilot training program.
Okay.
And they had 2 classes. I was in the first class, which started in 1939, I guess.
How many were in the class, do you remember?
Probably 1940. There were 10 of us.
10 in the class. And what kind of things did they teach you?
We earned a private pilot's license upon completion.
How long did it take to get that?
The exact time period, I don't recall.
Less than a year? Or
Oh, it was less than a year. We went right through the program, ground school and everything. And they set up an airfield and the classroom training and everything.
Where was the airfield located?
That was out north of Iowa Falls, out in the cornfields.
Was it like a regular airstrip, or?
It was a very primitive airstrip.
Okay. Like a pasture or
Pasture,
something?
right.
Who was the instructor for that program?
Well, let's see, I believe his name was Anderson. He's now deceased.
Did you have any flying experience before you entered that program?
None at all.
You told me earlier that you weren't even able to drive a car.
That's right. The instructor asked me to move the car one day and I couldn't do it.
And yet you were learning to fly an airplane.
I was learning to fly an airplane.
How much contact had you had with planes before you got into that program?
Well, since we didn't have a car or anything, I never did go out to view the barnstorming aircraft. So my first contact with an airplane was this civilian pilot training program. And the second time, I was up to the plane we were flying.
What kind of things did they do to teach you to fly? I mean, how much ground school did you have before you actually got behind the controls?
Well, it was concurrent, and the actual amount I couldn't tell you at this point, but we had all of the training necessary to qualify for a private pilot license.
Now, this was a civilian program, but was it geared towards going into the military?
Well, the objective, of course, was to form a reservoir of pilots that would later go into the military. And a couple of our buddies had gone in and been killed before I was ever given an opportunity to get it. There was no place for a black airman.
You mean that was simply prohibited?
They just made no provisions. They never intended that we fly.
Did you know that when you started the program at Ellsworth?
I never thought much about it.
Was that why you went into that program? Because you thought you'd be in the military someday and fly in the military? Or did you just want a private license for your own?
I used to take every type of training that came along. By the time all of the wartime training courses had gone by, I was an automobile mechanic, an arc and gas welder. I even got a card to go to the Kaiser shipyards, and I just took advantage of all this training.
Okay. So when you were learning to fly, that program was basically to form a reservoir of pilots for the military, and yet the military wasn't letting black pilots fly at that point.
That's right.
Did your instructor tell you that?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, it never came up. It was only in isolated cases like mine where you even had an integrated training situation. In other parts of the country, it would have been, the civilian pilot training program would have been all white or all black.
I see. So after you got done at Ellsworth, that's when you went into the service.
I was 1A for a year and a half. I finally enlisted.
Okay. And we were at war at that point.
We were in war.
And so this was July 42 that you went in?
I went in. I got tired of waiting.
Where did they send you to begin with?
Well, they didn't know what to do with me, even after I enlisted. So at Fort Leavenworth, they said, well, you can stick around until we come up with something, or you can go home. And so I went home, and then I was called up for cadet training. By that time, they'd gotten into flight training.
Okay. So where did they send you then after that?
Tuskegee.
Or you went straight to Tuskegee?
Straight to Tuskegee.
So tell me about Tuskegee. This is Tuskegee, Alabama, right?
Right.
And tell me about that program. What was that all about?
Well, they set up the initial pilot training at Moton Field outside of Tuskegee, and the program got its name from the institution.
The Tuskegee Institute.
At Tuskegee. And they did the elementary training, flight training, right there at Moton Field.
Okay. Now, did the other men that were in that program have the same background you did, already know how to fly, or were you ahead of the game there?
There was a mixture.
Okay.
but practically all the cadets had college. Good share of them had degrees. And in the first class of 13, they were all college trained, and one almost had his PhD. However, they only saw fit to graduate 5
Out of the whole class?
out of the whole class.
And how big was the class?
13.
5 out of 13.
See, they had a kind of a quota system. First place, they didn't want you, and they didn't know what to do with you after you graduated, and they had no intention whatsoever of utilizing you, that is, as far as the military was concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to be good, and you had to be lucky.
And this was like a pretty new program, wasn't it? There wasn't any kind of program like this before that?
No, this was brand new. They tried to place it at 2 white airfields, one in the east and one in the west, and neither air base would accept the program, so they set up one in the Southeast Training Command.
Okay. And so this was the first training program for black pilots in the U.S. military.
First and only.
Okay.
And I think the black newspapers, the black press had a lot to do with pushing. There was a lot of politics. Eleanor Roosevelt was really a catalyst there. She came down to visit what was to be the Molten Field, and she kind of startled the group because she insisted on having a flight, and she went up for a flight with Chief Anderson.
I think there's a picture of that in this book. I don't know if you're familiar with this book or not. Divided Skies?
No, I haven't read that one.
A little bit about...
And when she got back down, she said, well, I know one thing, they can fly. And of course, she took that message back to Washington, and shortly thereafter, they approved the training program.
Now, when you got back, you came home from Leavenworth, and when you first found out about Tuskegee, did you volunteer for that program, or did they say, well, because you've got
I was already trying to get into the flight program.
Okay, so they didn't really choose you for it, you asked for that program.
Right.
Okay. Well, you said that when you grew up in Iowa Falls, you didn't really experience that much racial discrimination. Was it different once you got to Tuskegee or into the service?
Once you left Iowa Falls, you started running into it. For example, I could go over to Waterloo, and they would sell you the food, but you couldn't eat it in the restaurant. And if you went to Des Moines, there was a black area, and that's where all the facilities were. None of the restaurants downtown would serve you.
And this was in the 30s, late 30s?
20s, 30s, early 40s.
How about in the military itself? Did you run into some discrimination there?
It was all segregated. You would run into discrimination if you left your facilities. Even Tuskegee, with a black school and black VA hospital, was segregated. And if you went to town on Saturday, you'd see the sharecroppers and farmers coming in their mule-powered wagons, and grandmother sitting up in the wagon bed in her rocker, and the kids running alongside with carrying their shoes to town. And then when they got to the square, all the blacks would be on one side and the whites would be on the other.
Good grief.
You had separate and unequal toilet facilities. One for black, one for white, black women, black men.
Was all that...
Separate water fountains. I always had a problem deciding which water fountain to drink out of.
All that was something new to you, wasn't it?
Right. And you had this Jim Crow. When I first went south, 3 of us left Iowa at the same time. Maurice Esters, and Luther Smith and I.
Dakota Tuskegee?
Tuskegee.
Uh-huh. Where were they from in Iowa?
Smith was from Des Moines. I'm not sure where Esters was from, possibly Fort Dodge.
Were you the only ones that ended up going to Tuskegee? Were there some other
We were
Iowans
the
later?
we were the first out of that area.
You three was the first from Iowa to go to the
Mhm.
Tuskegee program? There might have been some more later.
I'm sure there were some more later.
Okay. So you're saying about the Jim Crow laws?
Well, after you got so far south, we had, of course, Pullman accommodations. But when we went into the dining car, after we got so far south, we'd have to sit at the end of the car and they would pull the curtain. And first few times they did it, I got up and I'd pull the curtain back and the conductor would come back, pull the curtain back. Well, they didn't shoot us, I guess, but then we walked out, took our meals in the Pullman, but the trainman later came and said they would like the opportunity to serve us, would be pleased come on back, so.
Hmm. So you, the farther south you got, the more you ran into that kind of thing, even in Tuskegee itself.
Well, Tuskegee was segregated, like I said. The population was, majority was black, but it was still segregated. And of course we created a problem for them. Today, or in the last few years, the turnaround has been great. They now have a black mayor married to a white woman. So I'm sure all the Confederates are turning over in their grave.
Now, you had, did you have black officers at that program or white officers?
All of the top echelon was white. The base commander and the instructors, initial instructors were white.
Okay. Did that create any problems?
The first base commander, I don't think was really sold on the program, but there was the second one, Parrish, he was very cooperative.
Okay. So tell me about the training itself. What did they have you do there at Tuskegee?
Well, after the elementary course, then we went into basic and advanced at Tuskegee Air Base,
Okay.
Army Airfield.
What did you have to do there?
Well, let's see. We went through basic training in a fixed gear aircraft, and then we went into advanced, which was the AT-6.
Okay. What's a fixed gear aircraft?
Oh, non-retractable.
Oh, okay. Well, how long did the total training at Tuskegee take before you were considered qualified for
The
combat?
total training, let's see, I entered the program in September of 42 and graduated in May of 43.
So it's basically like a school year, one school
Right.
year, 9 months or so?
Very intensive training.
And how long was it before you were able to, what did they have you like go fly solo after a period of time, or was it always with a trainer behind you?
Oh no,
or-
you always flew solo at some point in the program. You received dual until they felt you were qualified, and then they turned you loose. Then you got a combination of dual and solo.
And you were being trained to be fighter pilots?
We were being trained, but we weren't sure what we were going to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out that we went into fighter training first. They had some old P-40s. I think they still had bullet holes from Chennaults.
From the Flying Tigers?
From the Flying Tigers, the old P-40s. Now those were single-seaters,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no dual. You read the book, you can learn to count all the switches. I think there was something like 13 switches. You went around the cockpit. When you felt you were ready, they said go.
Now, these were fighters. They had machine guns on, is that right? Or
Oh, they had everything on them, yeah.
what kind of weaponry did they have?
Well, they had package guns in the wings.
What's
I think
that?
I think they carried 450s
450 caliber machine guns? Okay, and those are in the wings?
in the wings.
Okay. Okay, so what else can you tell me about the training at Tuskegee? You say it was very intense. It would have to be
Very
completed in such a
competitive,
short
right.
time. A lot of guys wash out.
Most of them washed out.
Now, were some being trained for positions other than pilots, or like ground crew, or anything like that?
The entire base complement, from top to bottom, really, they were all black. In other words, they were training crewmen too.
Okay,
And there was a
ground crew.
ground crew, and they were trained at Chinook.
Okay. Were any of them trained to be like bomber personnel, or
No,
was it strictly fighters?
Just fighters, that came later.
Later on, they did train some bomber crews. Did any black crews ever serve as bomber crews?
No, none of them served in combat,
Okay,
but they did have B-25s,
okay.
and they trained, and they trained, and they trained, but they were never utilized.
And what position were you trained for?
Well, I went into fighters
As a pilot?
as a pilot,
Um,
starting with a P-40.
Okay. How's the P-40 compared to, like, the only one I'm familiar with is like, is it P-51 Mustang? Is it smaller than that, or?
The P-51 Mustang replaced the P-40.
So they're similar?
Similar and yet quite different.
Okay. Okay.
A P-40, you could do 450 standing on the nose, and that was the max.
450 miles an hour? Okay.
A P-51, it can creep up to 600 or so easy.
Is that right? So it was the P-51 was quite a bit faster,
They
but
were-
otherwise they're similar
They
aircraft?
were probably the best aircraft to come out of the war.
Really?
And
Well-
the P-40 was the first aircraft that we went into combat with, the old 99th,
The 99th Pursuit Squadron?
right?
Okay. Before, have we covered pretty much the training before you actually went overseas? Is there anything
Well-
else you want to comment on the training
Well,
itself?
we had to get 20 hours in the P-40 before you could go on leave.
Mhm.
You completed that transition. And that was probably the best 20 hours we ever spent. It was, you were on your own, of course.
Mhm.
And I had one incident, and after about 18 hours, I thought I was pretty hot. Well, I was. I love to do aerobatics. And I was at 10,000 foot over Auburn, Georgia. I love to do Immelmans, which is, you do a half loop and roll out at the top. And it's a maximum performance maneuver. And I got a little sloppy on the top of one, and I ended up spinning upside down. And try as I might, I couldn't get it out of the spin, and finally got it spinning right side up. I couldn't stop that one. So about that time, I remembered that in the book it said if you're still spinning at 5,000 feet, park the aircraft. So I proceeded to start looking for the little red handle to get rid of my canopy, and when I turned everything loose, the aircraft came out beautifully. Aircraft could fly better than I could.
So you didn't have to bail out?
No, but I leveled out about 1,200 feet, and when I got myself all together, why,
That's pretty low, isn't it?
that's pretty low.
Pretty close
I
call.
should have left the airplane. But that cooled me off. Probably saved my life.
Made you a little more cautious after that, huh? Was there, when you were in the training at Tuskegee, was there a feeling among you and the rest of the class that you needed to prove something because you were the first?
Oh, absolutely. We were going to graduate and become a pilot. We wanted to.
Why was that important?
Well, even though we were treated like second-class citizens, we considered ourselves first-class citizens. We were trying to fight for our country.
So everybody in the class probably felt that way, probably felt it was important to succeed. And
even though we knew that a good share of us wouldn't make it.
Wouldn't graduate.
They were graduating white pilots who couldn't fly as well as the one people they washed out. The instructors, in discussing it with their group at Maxwell Air Force Base, which is Maxwell Air Base at the time, said that there was no comparison, that they were better black pilots were being washed out than they were graduating as white pilots.
But they weren't able to do anything about that.
No, absolutely nothing.
So after you finished training, where did they send you after that?
Selfridge Air Force Base for further training.
Where was that located?
Outside of Detroit.
Okay. How long were you there?
We were there, let's see, I was there from May, well, I guess May, June, from summer up through December, at which time they activated the 332nd. But we trained in P-39s, Air Cobras.
Now, the 99th became part of the 332nd, is that right?
Later on in the combat theater, but the 99th, after much politicking, finally was sent overseas.
And you said after much politicking, was there reluctance to put the black pilots into combat?
Right.
Reluctance on whose part?
All of the higher brass.
Okay. Why were they reluctant to do that, do you know?
Discrimination. First place, they didn't think we could fly. They didn't think we would fight. And they gave all kinds of stupid reasons, of course, for not being utilized.
Mm-hmm.
The 99th was attached to a white unit in North Africa.
Is that where you went after Detroit?
No, I didn't join the 99th. Some of my classmates did, but
Okay. Where did you end up after Detroit?
I went overseas with the 332nd,
To,
the fighter group.
And you went where?
We went to Italy.
Okay.
And at that point, shortly after that, we became a 4-squadron group, the only one in the Air Force. Most groups had 3 squadrons.
Okay. What's the significance of that?
Well, they had 4 black squadrons, and the only place they were going to use them was in a all-black unit.
Kept them all together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And we were all black, top to bottom, from General Davis and Colonel Davis on down.
That's Benjamin O. Davis, Jr.? So he was your commanding officer?
Right. And he came along at just the right time. There was another individual who was determined to learn how to fly. He finally got into West Point in 1932, and he was the first one. Well, I guess there were a couple others at the time, but when he graduated, he was the first black to graduate in a 47-year period.
From West Point.
And when he went in, days were okay. Then they instituted the silent treatment, which is normally reserved for cadets who had violated the honor code and refused to resign. So no one spoke to him except in line of duty for 4 years. He slept alone, and normally he ate alone, and he was unable to get a life-saving certificate because no one would get in the pool with him.
Yeah, I sent you,
I get a little bitter.
understandably. Did you get to know him pretty well?
Very. I used to fly his wing.
No, he was a colonel then.
He was a colonel.
What was your rank?
Lieutenant.
Okay.
But when he flew with our squadron, I would fly his wing.
So he had a lot of confidence in you, it sounds like. To assign you that, that's an important position, isn't it?
Well, I guess so.
Okay, so you say when he took over or came over, that made a difference.
Well, we were fortunate in having an individual of that caliber with that military training to head up a unit that was isolated. We received no help when they threw us in combat. Normally, a white pilot would go in and fly with a seasoned combat pilot. They just threw us out and said, go for it.
Whereabouts were you stationed in Italy?
My squadron was at Salerno initially, and we had a couple more squadrons at Capodichino, outside of Naples.
Mm-hmm.
And from there we went to Ramitelli. We flew P-39s. That was with the 12th Air Force. Then they shifted us to the 15th for long-range escort duty. And we transitioned into P-47s and then into P-51s. Now can you imagine the logistic difficulties and the training that was necessary to shift from P-39s, which is a tricycle, water-cooled inline engine,
Mm-hmm.
to the P-47, the Thunderbolt, which was the biggest fighter ever built, weighed 7 tons, and a double-banked radial engine. And all the pilots had to transition from P-39s to P-47s. And these were all single-seat aircraft. No dual. And under combat conditions. And then when they got the 51s, actually we inherited the P-47s from units that were getting the new P-51. When they had enough P-51s, then we transitioned to the 51s.
Without training, apparently. Without adequate training, when you just had to switch without any
You had
training?
to switch. Oh, well, you flew the aircraft 2 or 3 times. I think maybe the 3rd or 4th time I was in the P-51, I was on a mission.
Let me check something here.
You want to cut just a minute?
Pardon me?
You want to cut this for just a minute?
Sure.
He flew up to St. Paul to the Confederate Air Force Convention. You've probably heard of that.
You're right. They come to the air shows in Iowa.
Okay. Chief Anderson was still flying, still instructing, still flying his own airplane, and he was 84 years old.
Is that right? I found this.
Eleanor Roosevelt was quite a woman.
Did you see her when she came down there? Or did you?
No, I wasn't there
You
then.
weren't there then. One of those, I think, is the P-40, right?
Yeah, that's the top one. The PT-17 was our initial training aircraft, a biplane.
Mm-hmm.
The BT-13, the Bolte vibrator, was our basic aircraft. The AT-6 was used for advanced training. And the P-40, this was our transition aircraft.
And that's the one you first used over in Italy.
No, first one, the P-39.
Oh, P-39, yeah.
Wait, the P-39 was the aircraft that our group flew.
Okay.
The 99th flew the P-40.
Okay. The 332nd used the P-39.
P-39, 12th Air Force.
Okay, well, I'd like to ask you about some of those missions. You said later on you did bomber escort. What did you do at first? What were your first missions?
Strafing, convoy patrol was our primary duty.
Okay.
We would cover the convoys, and probably one of the most interesting situations I ever ran into. Vesuvius erupted in March of 1944, and our airfield, the airstrip, I think was a 3,500-foot PSP, but pier strip planking.
Okay.
And we had lights, so therefore we flew all of the before dawn and after dark missions. And at the time the Vesuvius erupted, we would take off before dawn, and then we'd fly out and we'd pass over Vesuvius. You'd see all that red lava flowing down the side. It was beautiful. And the volcanic ash, when it falls, it sounds like rain on your tent, and it piles up like snow. And then from there we'd head out east over the Mediterranean, and you'd see that sunrise coming up over the Mediterranean. Beautiful sight. And then ships stretched for miles, the convoys coming through. Well, our job was to fly cover for the convoys.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were at a base originally in Salerno. I assume there were lots of white troops around, but did you run into any problems there?
We never saw them.
You were kept separate?
Separate. We had our separate, at Salerno, we had our separate clubs and everything.
Okay.
The only time I ran into white troops was later on out of Ramatelli when we moved to the 15th, when we'd go on R&R, like to Rome.
Mm-hmm.
There was no discrimination there. You were with white crews then.
There was no segregation. Was there any discrimination? The
None I noted particularly, no.
Well, that's good.
And that was one of my second experiences, which is very unusual. I was with a group of white officers standing outside of the Vatican, and this wasn't pre-planned, at least on my part. I found myself being ushered into the Vatican, and they seated us, they formed a circle, and the Pope, Pius XII, came in. They carried him in with these comic opera guards and set him down, and he walked around the group and spoke to all of us.
Just because you happen to be there.
Yeah.
A chance.
Yeah.
Hi there, excuse me. It's okay, this will be okay for us to do one
Yeah, we're just checking on that thing, right?
Yeah, and then we'll be done by 2 o'clock.
They okay to late checkout for 2 o'clock.
Okay, yeah, we had you done on the meeting this morning.
Oh, okay.
All right,
All
thanks.
right, thank you.
Okay, so these first missions, you would strafe what kind of targets?
Oh, airfields, just about anything, right?
And these targets were in northern Italy or?
Northern Italy. Let's see, we weren't over an hour or so from the enemy lines. But most of our P-39 flights were convoy patrol.
Okay. So then you later switched to bomber escort. What kind of plane were you using then? Still the P-39?
No, we transitioned into the P-47.
Okay. And that was used for bomber escort.
Bomber escort. It burned so much gas, however, that our radius of action was approximately 350 miles. And we could hear the Germans come in as soon as we had to turn around.
So in other words, you could escort the bombers just so far.
Right.
And once you had to turn back, you could hear the German
Fighters
fighters
come in.
So they would stay away until they saw you leave?
Right. Mm-hmm. They knew when we'd have to turn around.
Did you ever have any contact with enemy fighters escorting bombers?
And we had a couple jump.
that you were involved with. Tell me about that. How'd that go?
Well, Davis had one rule. We were not to leave those bombers and go off chasing enemy fighters. In fact, later on, bomber crews would request our outfit because they knew we'd give them good cover. We never lost a bomber to enemy fighters.
That's a pretty good record. How about during the strafing missions earlier with the P-39? Did you ever have encounters with German fighters then?
No,
Just during the bomber
just ground
escorts?
fire, yeah.
How many, do you call that a mission or a sortie, or what do you call each time you go out?
It's a sortie or a mission.
Okay, how many missions would you say you flew altogether?
I flew 68, and that was in spite of being grounded for a period of time due to aircraft accidents.
68 missions, and that was over what period of time?
Well, I was over there from January of 44 until December 44.
In those 68 missions, how many times did you have contact with the enemy, would you say?
Or normally you would see them. You wouldn't necessarily make contact with them.
How many times did combat develop out of those contacts, would you say? I mean, is it rare, is it common?
Well, maybe 50-50 you might. See, our objective was to keep the enemy fighters from coming in on the bombers,
Mm-hmm.
but we were not to chase them.
You were to stay near the bombers.
Mm-hmm.
How many times did you exchange fire with the enemy, do you think?
Oh, just a few times.
Were you ever involved in shooting down an enemy fighter?
No, I don't have anything confirmed. Yeah, we shot at some, but
And they were never able to shoot down a bomber while you were escorting, but were they able to hit some of them?
well, the actual hits, I don't know. We never lost one. The way they would do that, you would kind of leapfrog. One group would take the bomber so far, then another group would relieve them and take them, I'll say, in at the target and start them back, and then another group would finish it.
Were these bombers B-17s or B-25s?
B-24s and B-17s. B-24s would usually cruise at 25,000 foot. We like that. B-17s would climb all the way to the target. It might be 35,000 feet by the time they got the target, and we had to struggle to stay above them.
Did you have to have oxygen at that altitude?
Oh, absolutely.
Above what, 10,000 you have to have oxygen? So how many bombers would you escort and how many fighters would be escorting them?
Well, our group, we put up 72 aircraft a day. 8 of those would be spares. The bombers, they stretched for miles.
So there'll be more bombers than fighters.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Are any of those missions, any of those stand out in your mind, and particularly hairy or unusual?
Oh, probably the hairiest one was I had a flight of spares, 4 aircraft. We were to fill in for any aircraft that had to drop out. I had 2 new ones. They were all green. And one of them, I don't think he was even 20 years old at that point. But he said he was tired. His name was Brown. He was tired of seeing enemy aircraft and not shooting down anything. And he said if he saw one, he was going to go get it. Well, I took this flight of 4, and we sat outside of the group, and we hit weather. That meant they had to take all those aircraft through the weather, and I ended up on top all by ourselves. So I kept on going, and with 4 aircraft, I relieved the, I think it was the 52nd group, 4 of us. Well, when they saw the red tails, they left. And so I set up a pattern over the bombers, and some 190s came in, and we headed into them to break them up, which they did, and there were aircraft all over the sky, of course, for a while there. And I looked around and found I was all by myself. My wingman, I kept calling him. The last I saw of my wingman, he was on the tail of a 190, and the 190 was on his tail, and he never did answer me. The other 2, I don't know where. One, we lost the 2 young pilots, and I dived on this one. Now this is one of the problems we had. We had brand new aircraft. We didn't know what those aircraft would do. Nobody bothered to tell us. And no one had ever told me that if you dive in a P-51 at an excess speed and got any side pressure, you would blow your canopy. Evidently I was going too fast, and I lost my canopy. I had my goggles setting up on top of my helmet. The canopy took my goggles. I thought I had been hit, so I took some evasive action. And when I got straightened out, I was the only one up there. There wasn't an aircraft in sight.
That's not good, is it?
And not when you're 600 miles from home. So I had no goggles, no canopy, so I did climb up maybe 20,000 foot here, and I flew, and I crossed the Alps. I had to cross 2 enemy airfields, but I didn't have any problem.
Okay.
I was grounded for a week with wind, from wind-burned ice.
You said 190s. Those are Focke-Wulf 190s?
Focke-Wulf 190s.
German fighters.
German fighters.
Tell me about the red tails. What does that mean?
Each group had a designated color for identification. The 332nd had red tails. The 325th had checkerboard tails. The 31st had candy stripe tails. The 52nd had yellow tails. And all these airfields were located in the Fuji area.
So that's how they knew it was your group, by the red
Right.
tails of your planes. Okay.
And one of the stories, in fact, they played that up in the movie, was that a couple of our pilots saved a B-17 crew that was being attacked by enemy fighters. It wasn't, the bomber was not our responsibility, but they did fight off these enemy fighters, and the bomber pilots, out of gratitude, they came over to our airfield to thank the pilots. And when they saw the pilots, at least one of them said, "That ain't so." He discovered they were black pilots.
And that's in that HBO movie?
Yeah, that's an HBO movie.
And you remember that really happening?
That really happened, yeah.
Any other missions stand out in your mind, or anything unusual happen on any of these of the 68 missions?
Well, I got shot up on one.
Tell me about that.
In the P-47. We had a milk run. We thought, still had our tanks on, and the gun switches off, coming back across the Adriatic. And I was sitting in the sun. That meant that the number 4 man across from me was supposed to be keeping me covered. Well, I heard these explosions, and I looked around for these characteristic black puffs of smoke, and I didn't see any. So I looked out and glanced out at my left wing, and there was a row of 1-inch holes coming down the wing. And I looked up, I turned into this ME-109. swastika looked the side of a barn door.
So,
And the second one went by, he didn't get a chance to fire on it. They just dived through and kept going.
so they shot up your wing, but it didn't
Up.
keep you from flying.
No, I brought the aircraft back and never flew again. That's as close as I ever got to.
It's pretty close.
The adrenaline really starts flowing. But everything becomes automatic. I got rid of my tanks and turned on the gun switches, and the thing, aircraft shuddered all the way around the turn. I was pulling contrails, but you know, it just becomes second nature.
68 is a lot of missions, a lot of sorties.
Well, that was another irritating factor. Bomber crews rotated with 35 missions. White fighter groups rotated with 50 missions. We rotated when we got replacements.
No matter how many you'd flown, even if it was more than 50.
That's right.
So you were really, because of racial discrimination, you were put at risk more than the white fighter pilots were.
Some of the 99th pilots that had been flying short missions out of North Africa, where they might get in 2 or 3 missions a day, they had over 100 missions.
So by the end of the war, you feel that the 99th and 332nd had proven their point?
Well, I'd come home in December of '44, but later on, our group went to Berlin, and by that time, the bomber groups had started asking for our group.
That's a pretty good indication that you've done a good job. All your missions were over Italy, though?
Europe, over Europe. And it could be anywhere from Greece to inner Germany.
You did fly some over Germany?
Oh
yourself?
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Some of those 68 were over
Well,
Germany?
and we went to Bucharest, we went as far as Ploesti, and went to the Ploesti
Oil
airfields
fields.
Several times.
Mhm. All those were within range of your field in Italy, huh?
Right? Could be 5 to 6 hours.
Those were bomber escort.
Bomber escort.
You didn't go on any strafing missions?
No,
but,
no.
All the strafing missions were in Italy, pretty much?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Or from southern France.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so let me just check my list of questions here, make sure I haven't covered near as much as I would have liked to. Did you, well, you mentioned the 2 young pilots that were killed. Did you lose any good friends during the war?
I lost all of my tent mates.
How many men was that?
4.
4 of the men?
Slept 4 to 10. Let's see. Maples, Ferguson, Valentine. I didn't think of the 4th one. Anyway, I lost 4 pilots out there. And they put a ground officer in to keep me company.
You were the only one of that tent to survive the war.
Right. We lost 66 pilots out of 450.
Is that comparable to white units or is it higher?
I don't know. No comparison factor. Became like Russian roulette after a while, you know. If you fly long enough, you know something's going to happen. And so it isn't fear, it's apprehension, I think you may call it, because you know something's going to happen, but you don't know what it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
I saw one pilot burn up right in front of me. We would line up 2 squadrons at each end of a mile runway. And one squadron would take off in one direction, and the flares would go off. The squadron would go from the opposite direction until we had all the planes up. But flying jugs, again, probably inexperienced, one pilot racked it too tight on takeoff and spun in with a full load of gas and everything. We carried 265-gallon external tanks, so you can imagine what kind of a bonfire that would make.
So he crashed right on takeoff.
Well, on the turn, yeah, he had pulled it too tight and the stall went in. And on one mission after a stand down, that was a P-47. The P-51s aircraft are lined up across the runway from each other. And one of these planes that didn't make it, he taxied in and locked him into the cockpit, and so he burned up right in front of us. But once the mission gets cranked up, it doesn't stop for anything.
They just kept going,
They
even
kept
with that
going.
happening. Comment you'd like to make, especially on the fact of being sort of pioneer?
We broke a lot of barriers, and of course, coming back from combat, they still didn't have any jobs for us. I ended up instructing for a while, and then went to aircraft maintenance training, and later on I became an aircraft maintenance officer after desegregation.
Mm-hmm.
But we had combat pilots put off of trains because a colonel in the dining car didn't want to eat with them, or he ordered him off the train. Pilot and his wife. Now you can imagine how humiliating that is. When you rode on, if you didn't have Pullman accommodations, the segregated on a train, for example, the first car in back of the baggage car was the car for colored. And no matter how crowded that car got or how empty the rest of the train was, that's where they rode. If the conductor felt kindly, he'd open the baggage door and car door, and kind of, I've slept taking a mini nap on the mail sacks.
I read a story, I don't know if it was in the article you sent me or somewhere else, that black pilots who had risked their life overseas coming back to the United States were on a train and were asked to move to the back so that German prisoners of war could take their seats. Did you ever see that or hear of that?
No, but the German prisoners of war were quartered. They could do anything they wanted to do. They could eat in the restaurants. In Louisiana, one group, I don't know whether they were Italian or Germany, had the run of the town, full access to anything they wanted, dating and all, but my black countrymen were denied all of that. And I think the low point in my life was my combat tour. I finally got rotated. They sent me to Naples. I didn't even eat my Christmas dinner. I left on Christmas Day. Spent several days at the replacement depot. Came time to get on board ship. I was with a group of officers. I was the only black military man in the president. I met a Sergeant Hill from Iowa Falls, believe it or not, and we had a long talk with him. Well, the officers went first, and there was a short, fat, redneck captain standing up there going through that list of names. We were going through. When he got to me, he ordered me to the end of the line. And I'm just a lieutenant, and I just wanted to go. And I finally turned and went to the end of the line. But that was my reward for a year of combat. He'd probably never seen a day of combat. I couldn't have. That's the only time I ever felt like killing anybody. I had been shooting at the Germans, they'd been shooting at me, but it was a one-on-one. But my own countrymen, that was the first time I ever felt like killing somebody. Now, if I'd felt that way toward the Germans, I would have been an ace many times over. Well, I'll never forget that.
I can see that would be a low point. That's pretty
Yeah.
bad.
It was dark by the time I got on board ship, and I had to find the officers' quarters. And that was not the best accommodations. We slept in a cabin built for two. There were 17 of us. We were stacked 5 high.
How far do you have to go like that?
Oh, 7 days, Naples to Boston. We were running at 32 knots by ourselves. When we got to Boston, it was 15 below and snow on the ground, and the POWs were doing all the work around the dock. Had nice and fresh issue overcoats, living better than the troops were.
Yeah, there's something wrong with that picture. Anything else you'd like to add or comment on? I wish we had more time. But
Yeah. Well, that's when life began again, back to being a second-class citizen.
So you ran into quite a bit of discrimination
Just the
moving
usual,
around
yeah.
the country. Is Iowa Falls the only place you've lived where you didn't experience that?
Well, not since desegregation was. No,
Things are a little better
I've been
now?
to pretty nice, but oh, yeah, absolutely.
Why do you think that was that Iowa Falls is like that? You'd think a really small community that would have been worse instead of better there.
Well, what happens when people get to know you, then
True.
you're no longer a threat to them. And that's the problem with being different. You have to learn to accept differences. And once you do that, of course, then they forget.
Yeah.
To make
Because
it
it's a small
accept-
community to get to know your personality and what
Mhm.
you like, and I suppose that's true.
Did you know, I think they call him Ozzy McCullers?
Yeah, he lived next door to me. Mhm.
He's back in Iowa Falls now.
I heard he was coming back. He's retired.
And I asked him, for an interview, and he's pretty bitter about the way he was treated, and really
And-
wasn't willing to. But
You mean in Iowa Falls?
yeah. No, I mean the way the way he was treated in the service, and how he was treated when he came back to Iowa Falls.
Well, that's.
He apparently had some bad experiences.
You only hear, well, when you come back as a pilot and an officer, that's one thing that counts. But I should say at this point, we had an all-black outfit, top to bottom, and they were all good. I had a crew chief. I never had to bring a plane back for mechanical difficulties.
That's pretty good out of that many missions.
Right. And of course, we got support from the black population all around the country. First place, you had to depend on them, because wherever you went, you would normally look for that area where you could get full service, because you
Mhm.
never knew where you could get a meal or where you could sleep.
And I assume it was worse in the South. I mean, not that it's confined to the South, but
Well, it's really no better in the north.
really,
Uh,
you didn't notice any difference?
Well, the only difference, you expected it in the south. You never knew when you were going to hit it in the north.
Well, I wish we could talk about your time in Korea and some of these other things. It doesn't look like we're going to be able to. But this photo belongs to Darrell Roberts. He wanted me to show it to you. If it brings back any memories or not. It's supposed to, I guess that's Darrell on the left and you in the middle. And that's
Mhm.
apparently in Japan in
Right.
1952.
Mm-hmm. And it was unusual. There were 5 people from the Iowa Falls area. We got 4 together in a picture at one point. We were flying these C-119s.
Do you remember who the other ones were from Iowa Falls that were there?
No, not at this point.
What base was that?
The Shia, down on Kyushu. And I was a wing technical inspector. and I was responsible for monitoring the maintenance on 96 C-119s and 27 C-47s and a flight of Greeks.
I know the C-47 is, but what's the what was the other one?
C-119, that was a twin-engine boxcar, flying boxcar.
Cargo transport?
Cargo.
Okay. Well, that's something we're gonna check out, right? We'll be charged for another day.